Hey everyone, I'm Shaun Hagen, CEO of Carton Cloud, and welcome to This Week in Logistics. Each week, we break down what actually matters in logistics, not just the headlines and not just the hype. We talk about what happened, why it matters to you, and what you should do next. Last week, we talked about the execution gap in robotics. This week, we're going to be talking about resilience because the global supply chain is undergoing another massive stress test as we speak. Over the last 72 hours, the scope of the US-Iran conflict has widened dramatically, threatening to choke off the Strait of Hormuz. We're seeing immediate 50% price hikes in some shipping lanes and massive airspace closures. At the same time, we're tracking security unrest shutting down freight nodes in Mexico, a major acceleration in global rail intermodal adoption, and rising predictability standards in retail last mile. Resilience isn't a buzzword this week, it's a mandatory operational playbook. So let's get into it. Let's start with a quick run through of the major stories that are moving the needle. First, we have the Middle East escalation. The US and Israeli strikes over Iran over the weekend have effectively frozen the Persian Gulf. Iran's Revolutionary Guards have explicitly threatened to set fire to any commercial ship attempting to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, with at least 4 merchant ships already attacked, and Dubai airspace is heavily restricted. We're looking at a profound shock to global energy and freight networks. Second, the Mexico security unrest. On a localized level, security unrest in Western Mexico has disrupted logistic flows around the critical hubs of Guadalajara and Manzanillo. Operators are being forced into emergency reroutes to protect drivers and freight. Third, the modal shift to rail. In the US, Norfolk Southern and CMA CGM just announced a new intermodal service aimed at shifting long-haul highway freight to rail. Meanwhile, in Australia, the Inland Rail project hit a new milestone for double-stack freight, and New Zealand's Kiwi Rail just posted a massive 73.4 million half-year surplus. Rail is really having a moment right now. And finally, retail expectations. Home Depot launched real-time tracking for large item deliveries using driver handheld devices. And whilst it sounds simple, it's a massive signal for where 3PL SLAs are heading. If you zoom out, these stories cluster into 3 buckets: global disruption, modal shift, and rising service expectations. Let's unpack what that actually means for operators. So we'll start with the big one, disruption. And right now, the Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed to commercial shipping. For context, roughly 20% of the world's petroleum products move through that choke point. Combine that with the ongoing Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, which impacts the Suez Canal and about 30% of global container traffic, we're in a severe maritime crisis. Analysts at Proxima are warning of a prolonged conflict, and over the weekend we saw shipping companies pause or turn back ships, insurance policies get cancelled, and spot prices hike by up to 50%. And it's not just ocean freight. Massive swathes of Middle Eastern airspace, including Dubai's cargo hubs, are facing closures due to drone threats. Now, you might be thinking, running a regional 3PL in the Midwest or New South Wales, what does the Strait of Hormuz actually have to do with me? And I think we've had enough global crises over the last 5 or so years that we know that they have a bleed-on effect. And it has obviously everything to do with you because of what it does to fuel surcharges, landed costs for products, and capacity crunches. Fuel bills are going to spike, and inflation on energy-dependent goods like food will likely follow. And whether it's a massive geopolitical event in the Middle East or the localized security unrest we saw this week shutting down roads in Guadalajara in Mexico, the root operational problem is exactly the same. A critical node has gone offline. And when a node goes offline, the difference between scrambling and stabilizing comes down to preparation and communication. Operators who survive these shocks don't improvise. They execute a pre-built playbook and keep all of their stakeholders informed. If one of your top 3 freight nodes went offline tomorrow, who decides the reroutes? Which alternate carriers are already vetted and approved? And what's the exact template you use to communicate delays to your customers? Because disruptions don't damage margins as much as uncertainty does, and clarity comes from having already made the hard decisions. So shifting from water to tracks, we're seeing steady, undeniable signals that long-haul conversion to rail is accelerating globally. In the US, rail currently moves about 10.6% of total freight tonnage, but the new Norfolk Southern and CMA CGM service is targeting a very specific slice of the pie, shifting long-haul highway freight over to intermodal. Intermodal container traffic now makes up over 47% of the US rail freight market, and as trucking capacity tightens and emissions mandate loom, this is likely to only grow, notwithstanding the risk of energy crisis. Looking at Australia, rail presently carries an impressive 49% of domestic freight tonnage, but as all Australians can tell you, there is a catch. And over 80% of that is bulk commodities like iron ore and coal. Rail's share of containerized freight is hovering down near about 9%, but that's changing. And the inline rail project milestones we saw this week were aimed at lowering route costs by up to 20% and pushing rail share of intercapital freight by up to 55% by 2030. Taking a look across the Tasman, in New Zealand, KiwiRail just reported a massive $73.4 million surplus. And while road transport still dominates New Zealand at over 90% of tonnage, KiwiRail moves roughly 16 to 18% of the country's total exports. And, what does this data mean for you? It means Intermodal shouldn't be treated as a fallback anymore. And, it may not always be the right tool for the right job, but it should be a deliberate product line, or at least part of your thinking as you look to the next 3, 5, 10 years. If you're a shipper or a 3PL, you need to look at your top 10 long-haul lanes right now, and have you modeled the cost, transit time variability, and the risk trade-offs of rail? And as rail services become more reliable and more cost-effective, your customers will expect you to present modal operations proactively. Structural shifts reward early adopters before capacity constraint comes into it. And then thirdly and finally, let's talk about last mile. And Home Depot's launch of real-time tracking for large item deliveries is a perfect example of a new reality. Retail no longer competes on speed alone, it competes on predictability. And this is the ultimate proof of a trend that we've been watching build for the last 5 or 6 years, which is what we call the B2C bleed over. The flawless visibility and updates you expect when you track a $50 t-shirt you bought online, that same expectation is now translating directly into a broader section of the supply chain. It doesn't matter if you're moving heavy machinery, bulk building materials, or pallets of wholesale goods. The consumer-grade e-commerce experience is rapidly becoming the baseline standard across almost every industry and fulfillment model. In fact, the data is staggering on this. Recent industry research shows that 80% of B2B buyers now expect B2C quality digital experiences. Furthermore, over 60% of them actually prefer a completely rep-free, self-serve buying and tracking journey. They don't want to call your dispatch office to find out where their freight is. They want a portal that shows them status updates, events, and a truck on a map. Because of this, even if you don't operate last mile, those retail expectations are cascading upstream. Customers expect live tracking, visibility, accurate ETAs, and the fast resolution of exceptions. If your warehouse accuracy is inconsistent or your scan compliance is patchy, you're going to get crushed in SLA negotiations this year. So where does that leave us? You and I can't control drone strikes in the Middle East, and, well, I don't know who's listening, so maybe someone out there can. And we can't control national rail infrastructure projects, but we can control how our operations respond to these macro pressures. Resilience isn't about predicting the future, it's about controlling your own four walls. So tying it all together, the 3-part operator playbook for the week. Number 1, control your routing. Build outage SOPs, document exactly who decides reroutes, what your first customer communications look like, and which backup carriers are pre-approved. Your ability to respond to a crisis right now is going to be what sets you apart from your competitors. Number 2, control your capacity. Identify intermodal candidates now. Take your top 10 long-haul highway lanes and model them for rail suitability. Make sure that you're proactive in looking at that as it's starting to evolve more and more over the next decade. Don't wait for a capacity crunch or a fuel spike to explore your options. And number 3, control your data. Audit your scan discipline. Pull your last 30 days of dispatch data. When are the timestamps inconsistent? When do milestones lag? Fix the data hygiene before your customers penalize you, and then you can get on the front foot. Looking ahead to next week, my watch is obviously heavily focused on the Middle East, waiting to see what happens in the Persian Gulf around security for commercial transit, or whether we're heading down the pathway of a sourcing paralysis, and that becomes a consistent theme of Q1. I'll also be watching to see how quickly these ocean freight spot rate hikes bleed into other parts of domestic inflation and other parts of freight charges across the whole global economy. And like we said last week, the operators who will win in 2026 are not necessarily going to be the ones with the best guesses. They'll be the ones who prepare early, model their scenarios, and respond with excellent execution discipline. I'm Shaun Hagen. If this was useful, share it with your team. This has been This Week in Logistics. I look forward to seeing you all next week.